Richard, after 3 decades with us, we're terminating your position effective immediately, my CEO said without looking me in the eye. Security will escort you to clear your desk within the hour. My name is Richard Harmon, 58 years old, and until that Thursday morning, I was the Chief Financial Strategist at Westlake Pharmaceuticals in Boston, Massachusetts. For 30 years, I had been the financial architect behind the company's ascent from regional player to global powerhouse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just yesterday I'd presented our quarterly forecast to thunderous applause from the board. Today I was being discarded like outdated equipment. Carolyn from Human Resources sat silently in the corner, clutching a manila folder labeled with my name, probably containing separation papers prepared weeks ago. I maintained my composure, nodding once. I understand. 3 simple syllables to acknowledge the erasure of 30 years. As I was led through the executive floor by a security guard young enough to be my grandson, I felt the weight of dozens of eyes following me, colleagues I'd mentored, projects I'd salvaged, careers I'd launched. Most quickly averted their gaze when I looked their way. News travels fast in corporate corridors. Mark Johnston, our new CEO of 8 months, watched from his office doorway, arms crossed. No goodbye, no handshake, just surveillance to ensure. My departure went smoothly. What none of them realized was that I wasn't just another aging executive being put out to pasture. I was the guardian of secrets that could send Westlake stock into free fall overnight. Not because I was exceptional, but because I was thorough, patient, and had been paying attention when others weren't. Back in my Brookline home, I sat in my study, staring at the rain pelting against the windows. 30 years of loyalty ended with a 70-second conversation. No warning, no transition plan, no farewell gathering, just gone. My wife, Catherine, brought me a scotch without a word. After 32 years of marriage, she knew when I needed silence. "They'll regret this," she said finally, her voice calm but edged with steel. I took a sip, feeling the familiar burn. Perhaps. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that I'd been documenting discrepancies in our recent acquisition of Helios Biotech for months. Something that would have remained buried in my meticulous files had they allowed me the dignity of retirement next year as planned. I joined Westlake Pharmaceuticals when it occupied just half a floor in a nondescript office building. Started when my son David was learning to walk. Now he was an orthopedic surgeon with children of his own. The company had grown from 30 employees to over 7,000 worldwide, with a market capitalization of $18 billion. $6 billion. I'd overseen the financial strategy for 17 acquisitions, helped navigate 3 economic downturns, and restructured our debt to fund the research that led to our 2 blockbuster drugs. I'd turned down 6 headhunting offers over the years, including 2 with substantial compensation increases. Loyalty meant something to me. Apparently, it meant nothing to Mark Johnston. Johnston had arrived 8 months ago with his Harvard MBA and a reputation for revitalizing legacy companies. His first town hall included phrases like disrupting outdated paradigms and infusing new DNA into the corporate culture. Corporate speak for clearing out anyone over 50. Initially, I'd tried to work with him to help him understand our industry's unique financial complexities. The pharmaceutical sector isn't retail or tech. Our financial horizons extend decades, not quarters. Our risk calculations involve human lives, not just profit margins. We need to embrace more aggressive financial strategies, he'd said in our first one-on-one meeting. Your approach is too conservative for today's market. I'd attempted to explain that my conservative approach had delivered 18% average annual growth over 30 years, and helped us weather the 2008 financial crisis without a single layoff. He'd nodded impatiently, eyes already drifting to his phone. 4 months ago, he'd brought in Vanessa Parker, 36, from a Silicon Valley biotech startup. Her official title was Senior Vice President of Financial Innovation, a position created specifically for her. Her actual role, it became increasingly clear, was to replace me. I began noticing my exclusion from critical meetings. Strategic discussions that had always required my input were suddenly being held without me. Financial projections I would, normally, review were finalized before I ever saw them. My team members were being reassigned one by one. "You seem distracted," Catherine had observed one evening as we sat on our back porch watching fireflies. "Is everything all right at work?" I'd sighed, swirling the ice in my drink. Just the usual changing of the guard. Nothing I haven't seen before. But this felt different. Previous leadership transitions had been respectful, acknowledging institutional knowledge while bringing in fresh perspectives. This was systematic erasure. Then came the Helios biotech acquisition. Westlake had been eyeing the smaller company for years, primarily for their promising immunotherapy pipeline. When Johnston announced we were moving forward with the purchase, I was initially supportive. Their research aligned with our long-term strategy. It was during the due diligence process that I first noticed irregularities. Certain financial documents were provided to my team, heavily redacted. When I requested complete access, I was told by Johnston that Vanessa would handle the sensitive materials. "We need to move quickly on this," he said. "Your team can focus on integration planning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. I might have let it go had I not accidentally received an email thread not intended for me. One of the junior analysts on my team had been copied on correspondence between Johnston, Vanessa, and representatives from Helios. The thread contained references to adjusting the Phase 2 trial data and recalibrating efficacy projections. Pharmaceutical development is built on data integrity. Misleading trial results isn't just unethical, it's potentially illegal and dangerous. I began quietly investigating, careful not to alert Johnston or Vanessa. What I discovered was deeply troubling. Helios had manipulated their Phase 2 trial data for their flagship immunotherapy drug, HLX-427. The actual efficacy was 23% lower than reported, and there were 3 unreported severe adverse events. Westlake was paying $2 billion for a company whose primary asset was significantly less valuable than represented. More disturbing was evidence suggesting Johnston and Vanessa were aware of these issues before proceeding with the acquisition. Emails referenced containment strategies for when the full clinical picture emerges post-integration. They weren't just overpaying for Helios, they were knowingly acquiring a potential liability that could damage patient trust, trigger FDA investigations, and expose Westlake to massive lawsuits. I documented everything meticulously. Downloaded emails, saved financial projections, recorded meeting notes. My plan had been to compile a comprehensive report for the board before my retirement, giving them the opportunity to implement corrective measures before the situation became public. Now, sitting in my study with 30 years of service reduced to a cardboard box of personal effects, I had decisions to make. Decisions that would affect thousands of employees, countless patients, and yes, the stock price that Johnston was so obsessed with maximizing. The next morning, I woke early, my internal clock still set to my corporate schedule despite having no office to go to. Catherine found me at the kitchen table, laptop open, organizing my files. "What's the plan?" she asked, placing a cup of coffee beside me. "I'm not entirely sure yet," I replied honestly, "but I need to be methodical." I spent the day reviewing everything I'd gathered, organizing it chronologically and by significance. The picture it painted was even worse than I'd initially realized. Not only had Helios misrepresented their data, but internal projections showed Johnston and Vanessa planning to use aggressive accounting practices to mask the acquisition's negative impact on our financials for at least 4 quarters, long enough for them to collect their performance bonuses. By evening, I'd drafted 3 different approaches. The first was direct. Send my findings to the board of directors. The second involved regulatory authorities, the SEC and FDA. The third was more strategic and would require patience. As I contemplated my options, my phone buzzed with a text from Emily Winters, my former executive assistant. Just heard. Absolute BS what they did to you. Everyone in finance is shocked. Parker already moved into your office. I didn't respond immediately. Emily had been reassigned to the marketing department 2 months ago, another piece of Johnston's puzzle falling into place. Later she texted again, "Weird vibe in the quarterly review today. Johnston announced you'd decided to pursue other opportunities effective immediately. Santos from legal looked ill." Michael Santos, our general counsel, had been with Westlake almost as long as I had. We weren't close friends, but we shared a mutual respect and institutional history. His discomfort at Johnston's characterization of my departure was telling. I decided on the third approach, the strategic one. The following day was Friday. Westlake's stock had closed at $212, $48 the previous day, near its all-time high. Johnston had scheduled an analyst call for Monday morning to discuss the Helios integration and updated quarterly guidance. The announcement would undoubtedly reference synergies and accelerated pipeline development, corporate euphemisms that would further inflate our already overvalued stock. I spent Friday preparing, not in anger but with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized my 3 decades at Westlake. I created a comprehensive dossier including original and manipulated Helios trial data side by side, email correspondence showing knowledge of the discrepancies, financial projections revealing the accounting maneuvers planned to hide the acquisitions, true impact regulatory compliance issues that would arise once the full data was inevitably discovered, the potential patient impact of proceeding with clinical development based on flawed data. By Saturday morning, I was ready. I reached out to James Chen, a board member who had joined Westlake 15 years ago at my recommendation. Unlike some directors who viewed their positions as prestigious sinecures, James took corporate governance seriously. "Richard," he answered, "on the second ring. I've been meaning to call you. This sudden departure, it doesn't add up." "I'd like to meet," I said simply. "Today, if possible. It concerns matters the board should be aware of before Monday's analyst call." There was a brief pause. "This sounds serious." "It is. The Botanical Gardens in 2 hours, by the koi pond." The location was deliberate, public enough to be safe, private enough for sensitive conversation, and definitely off-company property. When I arrived, James was already seated on a bench, feeding the colorful fish. At 62, he remained physically active and mentally sharp. He'd made his fortune in medical devices before transitioning to board service and philanthropy. 30. "Years deserved better than what you received," he said as I sat beside him. Several of us on the board were blindsided by the announcement. I handed him a sealed envelope. "This explains why Johnston was so eager to remove me quickly." For the next 40 minutes, I walked James through my findings as he reviewed the documents. His expression grew increasingly grave. "If this is accurate," he began. "Every piece is verifiable," I interjected. "I've included the sources and methods for confirming each element." He closed the folder. "Why bring this to me instead of going directly to regulators? Because Westlake is more than Johnston and Parker. It's 7,000 employees. It's patients who depend on our medications. It's decades of legitimate scientific advancement. I'm giving the board the opportunity to address this internally before external forces make that impossible. James studied me. You could have leaked this anonymously, created a short-selling opportunity for yourself first. I shook my head. That's not who I am. Never has been. What do you want the board to do? Postpone Monday's analyst call. Initiate an independent investigation into the Helios acquisition. Place Johnston and Parker on administrative leave pending the results. And disclose the actual trial data to the FDA immediately. James sighed heavily. You realize this will tank our stock price temporarily. Better a controlled correction than a complete collapse when this inevitably comes to light. He nodded, slowly. I'll call an emergency board meeting for tonight. 6 of the 9 directors are in town. We can video conference the others. He paused. Johnston won't go quietly. I'm aware. As I drove home, I felt no satisfaction, only resolution. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability and protecting what I'd helped build for 3 decades. Catherine was waiting when I returned. How did it go? James will bring it to the board tonight. We'll know soon enough. She took my hand. Whatever happens, you did the right thing. By 10 p.m. my phone rang, James's number. The board met for 3 hours, he said without preamble. We've reviewed your evidence and conducted preliminary verification. It appears to be substantiated. I waited. We've cancelled Monday's analyst call. Johnston and Parker have been placed on administrative leave effective immediately. An independent law firm has been engaged to conduct a full investigation, and we're preparing disclosures for the FDA and SEC. Thank you, I said simply. The board has also unanimously voted to request your return on a 6-month contract as acting CFO to help navigate this situation. Your institutional knowledge is irreplaceable in this crisis. I hadn't expected this. I'll need to think about it. Of course, but Richard, when this becomes public, and it will, our stock is going to take a significant hit. The board is preparing for a 30–40% drop initially. That's preferable to class action lawsuits and criminal investigations down the road. Sunday passed quietly. Catherine and I took our grandchildren to the park, deliberately avoiding business news or emails. This calm before the storm was precious. Monday morning I woke to my phone buzzing constantly. Westlake had issued a terse pre-market statement announcing the administrative leave of the CEO and SVP of Financial Innovation, pending an investigation into potential irregularities related to the Helios acquisition. The analyst call was postponed indefinitely. The stock had been halted pending this announcement. When trading resumed, the reaction was swift and severe. By mid-morning, Westlake shares had plunged 36%. Financial news networks were running breaking headlines: pharmaceutical giant leadership crisis, Westlake executives sidelined in acquisition scandal. Billions in market cap erased as Westlake investigation unfolds. My phone continued buzzing with calls and texts from former colleagues, industry contacts, even reporters who had somehow obtained my number. I ignored most, responding only to James and a few trusted former team members who reached out in genuine concern. Emily texted, "Holy chaos here today. Everyone's connecting the dots between your sudden exit and today's news." Santos called an all-hands meeting to assure everyone the company is stable. By afternoon, I'd made my decision. I called James. "I'll return as acting CFO on 2 conditions," I said. "Complete autonomy to implement proper financial controls and transparency measures, and the authority to build a remediation team of my choosing." "The board will agree to both," he responded immediately. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow. We need to get ahead of this quickly. As I ended the call, Catherine watched me with a mixture of pride and concern. Back into the fray? Just long enough to right the ship, I assured her. 6 months maximum. They're lucky to have you, she said. They always were. That evening, as financial analysts speculated about Westlake's future and social media buzzed with theories about the irregularities, I felt strangely at peace. The stock price would recover eventually once we implemented proper controls and transparency. The company would survive, perhaps emerge stronger. What mattered wasn't the temporary stock plummet, but the integrity restored. Sometimes the most loyal act isn't silent compliance, but having the courage to protect what you've helped build, even when those currently in charge have lost their way. As I prepared for my unexpected return to Westlake the next morning, I reflected on what these 30 years had taught me. Success isn't measured by titles or stock options, but by the standard you maintain when no one is watching, or when everyone is. Integrity isn't something you demonstrate when it's convenient. It's the consistent choice you make, even when it costs you. The market had indeed punished Westlake severely today, but markets eventually recognize and reward truth. Johnston had fired me, hoping to bury what I knew. Instead, he'd freed me to bring it to light. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all. Sometimes being discarded after decades of loyalty isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning of a different, more important chapter. As the sun set over Boston, I closed my laptop and joined Catherine on our porch. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight I could breathe knowing I had honored 3 decades of work in the most meaningful way possible, by protecting its legacy from those who would compromise it for short-term gain. "Ready for tomorrow?" Catherine asked, linking her arm through mine. I nodded, watching the last light fade from the sky. More than they realize. Tuesday morning arrived with a surreal quality as I walked back through Westlake's glass doors. The security guard, different from the one who'd escorted me out just days ago, did a double take before hastily printing a temporary executive badge. "Welcome back, Mr. Harmon," he said, a note of confusion in his voice. The lobby was unusually quiet, the typical morning bustle replaced by hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when people noticed me. James Chen was waiting by the executive elevator, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "The interim leadership team is assembled in the boardroom," he said as we ascended to the top floor. "Legal, communications, and the division. Heads, the independent investigators will join at 11. I nodded, mentally preparing. "And my office?" A slight grimace. "We've moved Parker's things. It's available." The boardroom fell silent as I entered. 14 faces turned toward me, displaying emotions ranging from surprise to embarrassment to cautious hope. Michael Santos, our general counsel, stood first, extending his hand. "Richard, thank you for coming back." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent the past 48 hours contemplating career-ending legal scenarios. I shook his hand firmly. "Let's be clear from the outset. I'm not here to assign blame or seek vindication. I'm here to protect this company, its employees, and most importantly, its patients. We have exactly one path forward: absolute transparency and accountability." For the next 3 hours, we dissected the situation. The Helios acquisition had closed 6 weeks ago. Initial integration was underway. The manipulated trial data for HLX 427 remained internal for now, but Phase 3 trials, based on flawed protocols, were scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. The financial statements for the quarter had been prepared using Johnston's aggressive accounting methods, ready for Monday's now cancelled analyst call. "First priorities," I said, standing at the whiteboard. 1. Full disclosure to the FDA regarding the HLX 427 data discrepancies. 2. Accurate restatement of our financials. 3. Transparent communication with employees and shareholders. Olivia Reyes, our head of communications, raised her hand. We've prepared holding statements, but the financial media is hammering us. CNBC wants an interview today. The Wall Street Journal is running a front-page story tomorrow regardless of our participation. I'll do the CNBC interview, I said. We control the narrative by owning the mistake and detailing our corrective actions. Lunchtime came and went with sandwiches brought in as we worked. By mid-afternoon, the independent investigators, a team from Latham and Watkins, had begun their process, setting up in a conference room down the hall. The board had issued a formal statement announcing my return as acting CFO. Westlake's stock had stabilized somewhat, down 33% from Friday's close. A brutal but not fatal decline. At 4:30, I stood before a CNBC camera in our corporate media room, the network's financial anchor questioning me from New York. Mr. Harmon, you were terminated last week after 30 years with Westlake, and now you're back as acting CFO amid allegations of financial irregularities. What exactly happened? I maintained steady eye contact with the camera. During the due diligence process for our recent acquisition of Helios Biotech, certain clinical trial data discrepancies were identified. It appears this information was not appropriately disclosed or addressed. The board has placed the CEO and SVP of Financial Innovation on administrative leave while an independent investigation proceeds. I've been asked to return temporarily to help navigate this situation. Are you saying Westlake knowingly acquired a company with falsified clinical data? What I can say is that we've identified inconsistencies between Helios's reported trial results and the underlying data. We've already initiated full disclosure to regulatory authorities. Patient safety and data integrity are non-negotiable priorities. Westlake's stock is down 33% since this news broke. How much worse could it get for shareholders? Markets respond to uncertainty. We're working to replace that uncertainty with transparency and accountability. The fundamentals of Westlake remain strong. Our existing product portfolio continues to perform well. We have 11 other clinical programs unrelated to Helios that remain on track. This is a serious but contained issue that we're addressing head-on. By the time I returned to my restored office, the interview was already being clipped and shared across financial news platforms. The early response from analysts was cautiously positive, acknowledging the seriousness but appreciating the transparency. The stock had even recovered 2 percentage points in after-hours trading. As I sat at my desk, the same desk where I'd worked for the past 15 years, the familiarity felt strange after my abrupt departure. Someone had attempted to erase all traces of my predecessor. Parker's motivational posters and Silicon Valley memorabilia were gone. My old family photo was back in its place, retrieved from God knows where. Emily appeared in my doorway, a tentative smile on her face. "Welcome back. Your calendar is updated, and I've pulled the files you requested." Despite her reassignment months ago, she'd slipped effortlessly back into her role as my assistant. "Thank you, Emily. What's the mood among the staff?" She hesitated, then closed the door. "Shocked, confused, but mostly relieved that you're back. There's been a tension here since Johnston took over. People were afraid to raise concerns." "That changes immediately," I said. "I need you to set up daily town halls for the next week. Different departments each day. No executive filters, direct communication." She nodded, making notes. "Legal wants time with you first thing tomorrow. The FDA liaison team, too." As Emily left, I turned to my window overlooking Boston Harbor. The same view I'd had for 15 years, yet everything had changed. I wasn't just addressing financial discrepancies. I was confronting a cultural failure that had allowed them to occur. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Saw your interview, proud of you. Dinner at 8. I smiled, typing back, "Might be later. Don't wait up." The next 72 hours passed in a blur of disclosures, meetings, and strategic decisions. The FDA had responded to our voluntary disclosure with appropriate seriousness, initiating an investigation but acknowledging our proactive approach. The SEC was similarly engaged. Our legal team was cooperating fully with both agencies. The independent investigation was moving quickly, with Johnston and Parker both interviewed under the supervision of their respective attorneys. Initial findings confirmed what I'd discovered, with additional concerning details emerging about the timing and intent of certain decisions. By Friday morning, a week after my termination, Westlake had issued comprehensive corrective disclosures, revised financial statements, and a clear remediation plan. Our stock had stabilized around 144 funds, a 32% decline from its pre-crisis level, but no longer in free fall. As I prepared for the all-employee town hall scheduled for noon, James Chen stopped by my office. "The board met last night," he said, taking a seat across from me. "The initial investigation report is damning. Johnston and Parker knowingly proceeded with the acquisition, despite being informed of the data discrepancies. They plan to quietly discontinue HLX 427 post-acquisition while using creative accounting to mask the financial impact." I nodded, having suspected as much. "And the board's decision? Termination for cause, effective immediately. We're also clawing back their signing and performance bonuses. The press release goes out at 11. Will there be criminal referrals?" James sighed heavily. "The evidence suggests potential securities fraud. The board has authorized Santos to cooperate with any criminal investigations that may arise." I took a moment to absorb this. Johnston and Parker had engineered my removal to prevent exactly this outcome. The irony wasn't lost on me. "There's something else," James continued. "The board would like to extend your acting role to a 2-year contract as permanent CFO, with a path to CEO if you're interested." The offer caught me off guard. A week ago, I'd been unceremoniously discarded. Now I was being offered the keys to the kingdom. "I'll need to think about it," I said finally. "My focus right now is stabilization." James nodded understanding. "Take the weekend. But Richard, the company needs you, not just for crisis management, but for rebuilding trust." The employee town hall that followed was unlike any meeting in Westlake's history. More than 2,000 employees attended in person or via video conference. Rather than the typical corporate platitudes, I opened with unvarnished truth. Last week, I was fired after 30 years with Westlake. Today I'm standing here because we're facing a crisis of integrity. The easy thing would be to blame 2 individuals and move on. The harder, necessary thing is to examine how our culture allowed this to happen. For the next hour, I answered questions directly, acknowledging what we knew, what we didn't know yet, and the challenges ahead. People were afraid for their jobs, their projects, their futures. I didn't offer false reassurances, but I provided clarity and commitment. This company was built on scientific integrity and patient focus. We lost sight of that briefly, but it remains our foundation. Every decision I make in the coming months will be guided by those principles. Some will be difficult, all will be transparent. As the meeting concluded, the applause wasn't celebratory but resolute, a collective acknowledgement that the path forward would be challenging but necessary. Back in my office, I found a stack of messages, analysts seeking insights, journalists requesting interviews, industry peers offering support. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Dr. Eleanor Katz, our Chief Scientific Officer for 24 years, and someone I'd always respected greatly. "Richard, in my experience, organizations don't fail because of one bad decision, but from 1,000 small compromises that precede it. Perhaps this crisis is an opportunity to examine which compromises we've normalized. I have thoughts when you're ready." Eleanor. Her perspective struck me as essential. While the financial and legal aspects of our situation demanded immediate attention, the cultural dimensions would determine our long-term recovery. I called her immediately and arranged to meet over the weekend. Saturday morning found us walking along the Charles River, the spring air crisp and clarifying. At 67, Eleanor remained one of our most brilliant scientific minds and most candid voices. When Johnston arrived, she began without preamble. He brought a philosophy that prioritized perception over substance. Quarterly targets became more important than quality research. Timeline accelerations were demanded without regard for scientific process. "Why didn't you speak up?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "The same reason you documented your concerns privately rather than raising immediate alarms. We've developed a culture where challenging leadership is seen as disloyalty rather than diligence." She stopped walking, facing me directly. "That's the real issue, Richard, not Johnston or Parker. They were symptoms, not the disease." Her assessment was uncomfortable, but accurate. Over decades of growth and success, Westlake had gradually shifted from a culture of scientific inquiry, where challenging assumptions was valued, to one of hierarchical deference. I'd been so focused on financial strategy that I'd missed this fundamental transformation. "What would you do?" I asked. "Structural reform, separation of scientific and financial oversight, empowered ethics officers in every division, protected channels for raising concerns," she smiled slightly, "and perhaps most importantly, leaders who visibly value those who question them." As we continued walking, I considered how these principles might be implemented, not as window dressing to satisfy regulators, but as fundamental rewiring of how Westlake operated. By Sunday evening, I drafted a comprehensive reform plan, addressing not just the immediate crisis, but the underlying cultural factors. Catherine reviewed it with her outsider's perspective, asking pointed questions that helped refine my thinking. "You're not just fixing a financial scandal," she observed. "You're proposing to transform a global corporation's DNA." "Is it too ambitious?" I asked. She smiled, the same smile that had sustained me through 30 years of corporate battles and personal challenges. "It's exactly ambitious enough. They fired Richard Harmon, the dutiful executive. They got Richard Harmon, the reformer, instead." Monday morning arrived with new energy and purpose. The weekend headlines had processed Johnston and Parker's terminations, with most coverage acknowledging Westlake's transparent handling of the crisis. Our stock had closed Friday at $147, even inching up slightly in pre-market trading. As I drove to the office, my mind kept returning to a question that had been forming since my return. What kind of leader did Westlake need now? Not just a financial steward, but someone who could reimagine a 30-year-old company's approach to integrity and accountability. The executive team was waiting in the conference room for our 8 a.m. strategy session. The agenda included immediate concerns, the ongoing FDA dialogue, investor relations strategy, legal contingencies, but I began elsewhere. "Before we address tactical matters, we need to align on something more fundamental," I said, distributing copies of my reform proposal. "This crisis didn't develop overnight. It grew from cultural soil we all helped cultivate." For the next hour, we engaged in the most honest conversation I'd experienced in my 3 decades at Westlake. People spoke about concerns they'd harbored silently for years, incentive structures that encouraged short-term thinking, promotion patterns that rewarded compliance over constructive challenge, information silos that prevented holistic risk assessment. Michael Santos, who had initially seemed defensive in our first meetings, leaned forward. "This goes beyond remediation. You're proposing a complete governance redesign." "Is that what's needed?" I asked simply. He considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, But the board will have questions about implementation timeline, costs, competitive impacts. I'll address those concerns, I said. But first, I need to know if this leadership team believes in this direction, not just intellectually, but viscerally, because rebuilding trust with employees, with regulators, with patients, requires more than policy changes. It requires personal commitment. One by one, each executive spoke. Some had reservations about specific elements, but all recognized the fundamental need for transformation. By meeting's end, we'd formed working groups to refine different aspects of the reform agenda, with a full proposal to be presented to the board on Friday. As the others filed out, Eleanor Katz remained behind. "Bold opening move," she commented. "Most crisis managers would focus solely on containing damage. We're beyond containment," I replied. "This is about redefinition." She nodded approvingly. Johnston would have had consultants produce a 100-page report full of corporate doublespeak. You're cutting to the heart of it. I had a wise colleague remind me what matters, I said, acknowledging her influence. The week unfolded with intensity but clarity of purpose. Each day brought new challenges, detailed questions from the FDA, class action lawsuit rumblings, concerned major shareholders, but also progress. The independent investigation continued, with preliminary findings supporting our disclosures and remediation approach. By Thursday, our reform proposal had evolved into a comprehensive blueprint for transformation, including a new ethics oversight board with independent members and direct board reporting lines, restructured incentive compensation tied to long-term outcomes and ethical metrics, protected whistleblower channels with third-party management, mandatory ethics training for all employees, with specialized modules for leadership, regular culture assessments with transparent results and action plans, revised scientific review processes with multiple independent verification stages. That evening, as I prepared for the board presentation, Emily brought me an unexpected visitor, Samantha Nolan, a researcher from the original Helios team who had joined Westlake through the acquisition. "She says it's urgent," Emily explained. "Something about additional HLX 427 data." Samantha entered nervously, clutching a laptop. Young, probably early 30s, with the intense focus common to dedicated scientists. "Mr. Harmon, thank you for seeing me," she began. "I've been following the disclosures about our trial data, but there's something important that hasn't come to light yet." "Please, sit," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "What is it?" "The manipulated efficacy data that's been reported, that's real and concerning. But there's more." She opened her laptop, turning it to show me a spreadsheet. "These are the complete adverse event reports from our Phase 2 trials. 3 cases were officially reported, but there were actually 7 serious adverse events, including 2 deaths that might be treatment-related. The implications were staggering. Beyond financial fraud, this suggested potential knowledge of serious safety issues that had been deliberately concealed." "How do you know this?" I asked carefully. "I was assistant director for the trial. When the data was being prepared for submission to Westlake during acquisition talks, I raised concerns about these cases being excluded. I was told they were being handled through appropriate channels and removed from the project." She met my gaze directly. "People could die if this drug moves forward based on manipulated safety data. Why bring this to me now?" "Because you came back. Because you're speaking about ethical reform rather than damage control." She swallowed hard. "And because Phase 3 trials would have exposed real patients to potentially deadly risks." I studied her for a moment, recognizing the courage it took to come forward. "Do you have documentation supporting this?" She nodded, pulling a flash drive from her pocket. "Everything. Original case reports, my emails questioning the exclusions, the revised reports with these cases removed." I took the drive, understanding its significance. This wasn't just about financial misrepresentation anymore. It was potentially criminal negligence with human lives at stake. Samantha, I need to involve our legal team immediately. This information changes everything. I understand, she hesitated. I needed to be sure someone would take it seriously. We will, I assured her. Your courage may have saved lives. After she left, I immediately called Michael Santos and Eleanor Katz, explaining the new information. Within an hour, we'd established a secure protocol for reviewing Samantha's evidence and updating our disclosures to the FDA. That night, alone in my study, I contemplated how narrow our understanding of the situation had been. We'd focused on financial fraud when the true stakes were much higher. Johnston and Parker hadn't just endangered our stock price, they'd potentially risked patient lives for acquisition synergies and bonus payments. My phone buzzed with a text from James Chen. Need to speak tonight. New information from investigation. When I called, his voice was grave. The investigators found email evidence that Johnston and Parker were explicitly informed about the adverse events before proceeding with the acquisition. They made a calculated decision to complete the deal quickly before this information could become widely known. That's beyond securities fraud, I said quietly. That's knowing endangerment. Yes. The board has authorized immediate criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. This goes beyond governance failure, Richard. This is potentially criminal conduct. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my study, the weight of the situation pressing down. When I'd been fired after 30 years, I'd focused on the financial misconduct I'd uncovered. I never imagined the depths to which the corruption had reached. Tomorrow's board presentation would need significant revision. This wasn't just about cultural reform anymore. It was about fundamental human ethics and accountability. The company I'd served for 3 decades hadn't just lost its financial integrity, it had nearly compromised its most basic responsibility to do no harm. Yet as devastating as this revelation was, it also brought clarity. The path forward wasn't just financial, restatements and governance tweaks. It was complete reimagination of what Westlake stood for and how it operated, not evolution, but revolution. Catherine found me still working at midnight, revising my presentation to incorporate this new understanding. She set a cup of tea beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. You can't fix 30 years of gradual compromise in a single week, she said softly. No, I agreed, but I can ensure we never compromise on what matters most again. She studied my face. This is becoming more than a 6-month assignment, isn't it? I nodded slowly. I think it might be the most important work I'll ever do. Her smile was understanding. Then do it right. As Tuesday turned to Wednesday, I finalized my vision for Westlake's transformation, not as a response to crisis, but as recommitment to purpose. The company had lost its way not in a single moment of corruption, but through countless small surrenders of principle. The road back would require equal persistence in the opposite direction. Sometimes being fired after 30 years of service isn't an ending. Sometimes it's the catalyst that allows you to see with clarity what must be done and gives you the freedom to do it without the constraints of institutional thinking. Sometimes losing everything you thought mattered reveals what truly does. Friday morning arrived with a weight of anticipation. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., with my presentation as the central agenda item. I'd slept little the previous night, fine-tuning my proposal and preparing for every possible objection. This wasn't just about saving Westlake anymore. It was about transforming it into something better than it had ever been. As I drove to the office, the financial news station reported that Westlake's stock had stabilized around 150s, still down significantly from its pre-crisis level, but showing signs of recovery as the market recognized our transparent approach to the situation. Several analysts had even upgraded their recommendations from sell to hold, noting that the underlying business remained sound despite the leadership failures. The boardroom was unusually full when I arrived. In addition to all 12 directors, the General Counsel and several members of the independent investigation team were present. James Chen had also invited Dr. Eleanor Katz, acknowledging that scientific integrity was now central to our crisis response. "Before we begin," James said, addressing the room, "I want to thank Richard for stepping into this situation with such clarity and purpose. Many in his position would have walked away after being treated as he was. His willingness to return is a testament to his character and his commitment to this company." The acknowledgement was appreciated but unnecessary. I hadn't returned for vindication or recognition. I'd returned because something valuable was at risk, not just a stock price or corporate reputation, but the trust of patients whose lives depended on our integrity. "Thank you, James," I said, standing to address the board. "What I'm about to present isn't just a crisis management plan. It's a fundamental reimagining of how Westlake functions as a business, as a scientific enterprise, and as a trusted healthcare partner." For the next hour, I outlined my comprehensive proposal, integrating the newest revelations about the concealed safety data. The presentation wasn't just about policies and processes, it was about values and purpose. I framed our current crisis, not as an isolated incident, but as the inevitable result of cultural drift, a gradual departure from the principles that had once guided the company. The easy path would be incremental change, I concluded. Adjust a few procedures, replace a few executives, issue carefully worded apologies. That approach might satisfy regulators temporarily, but it wouldn't address the underlying conditions that allowed this situation to develop. What I'm proposing instead is transformation, difficult, comprehensive, and necessary. When I finished, the room was silent. Not the awkward silence of discomfort, but the weighted silence of deep consideration. Eventually, Margaret Winters, our longest-serving director, spoke. "In my 22 years on this board, I've never encountered a proposal of this scope," she said, her voice measured. "It's ambitious, perhaps even radical, but I believe it's precisely what's needed." One by one, other directors weighed in. Some raised practical concerns about implementation timelines and competitive implications. Others questioned whether such extensive reform might distract from our core business. But none dismissed the fundamental premise that Westlake needed profound change, not cosmetic adjustments. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, James called for a vote on the general framework, with details to be refined in coming sessions. The proposal passed unanimously. "There's one other matter to address," James said as the vote concluded. "Richard's role going forward. The board's preference is clear. We would like you to accept the permanent CFO position with a clear succession. Path to CEO within 18 months. All eyes turned to me. A week ago, I'd been unceremoniously dismissed after 3 decades of service. Now I was being offered leadership of the company I'd helped build, but a company that needed to be substantially rebuilt. "I'll accept the CFO position," I said after a moment's consideration. "As for the CEO succession, let's revisit that question in a year, when we can better assess our progress and needs." James nodded, satisfied with this compromise. "Then it's settled. We'll announce the permanent appointment immediately." As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor approached me, a hint of a smile on her usually serious face. "Congratulations, CFO Harmon. Ready to remake a pharmaceutical giant." "One ethical decision at a time," I replied. The next weeks unfolded with methodical purpose. We established 5 core transformation teams, each focused on a critical dimension of our reform agenda. Governance structure, scientific integrity, financial transparency, ethical culture, and patient-centered innovation. Every team included cross-functional representation, ensuring diverse perspectives and breaking down the silos that had contributed to our crisis. The FDA investigation continued, but our proactive disclosures and remediation efforts had established a cooperative rather than adversarial relationship with regulators. We'd voluntarily halted all work on HLX 427 and initiated a comprehensive review of all clinical programs, not just those from Helios, but across our entire pipeline. 30 days after my return, we held an unusual Investor Day. Rather than the typical showcase of promising pipelines and growth projections, we presented our transformation roadmap with unflinching honesty about past failures and future challenges. "We're not here to tell you that everything is fixed," I told the assembled analysts and institutional investors. "We're here to show you how we're fixing it, step by step, with transparency and accountability." The response was cautiously positive. Our stock had recovered to 165, still well below its pre-crisis peak, but reflecting growing confidence in our direction. Several major institutional investors even increased their positions, recognizing the long-term value of our approach. Inside Westlake, the culture was shifting palpably. The protected whistleblower channel we'd established had already received dozens of reports, some trivial, others substantive, all taken seriously. Our new scientific review boards included external experts who challenged our methodologies and assumptions. Compensation structures were being redesigned to reward long-term value creation and ethical leadership rather than quarterly targets. Most significantly, people were speaking up. In meetings at all levels, I observed a new willingness to question, to challenge, to raise concerns without fear of repercussion. The message was taking hold. At the new Westlake, silence in the face of potential issues wasn't loyalty, it was a failure of responsibility. 6 weeks into the transformation, I received an unexpected visitor. Samantha Nolan, the Helios researcher who had brought forward the concealed safety data. "I wanted to thank you personally," she said, seated across from me. "The changes you're implementing, they're not just corporate window dressing, they're meaningful." "Your courage made much of this possible," I acknowledged. "Coming forward, as you did, carried real risk." She smiled slightly. "That's actually why I'm here. The new scientific integrity team has asked me to lead a working group on clinical data transparency protocols. I wanted your perspective on whether I should accept." The request surprised and pleased me. "Absolutely. Your experience makes you uniquely qualified. Just remember that cultural change is marathon, not a sprint. Some resistance is inevitable." "I'm prepared for that," she said with quiet confidence. "What happened at Helios and almost happened here can never happen again. Not on my watch." As she left, I reflected on how crisis often reveals character, both institutional and individual. Johnston and Parker had shown their priorities when faced with difficult choices. So had Samantha. So had I. The true measure of our transformation wouldn't be our policies or procedures, but how we responded when those inevitable, difficult choices arose again. 2 months after my return, the Department of Justice announced formal charges against Mark Johnston and Vanessa Parker. Securities fraud, wire fraud, and, most seriously, conspiracy to defraud the United States by concealing material information from the FDA. If convicted, they faced potential prison sentences. The news hit mainstream media immediately. Former Westlake executives charged in fraud scheme. DOJ, pharmaceutical executives concealed critical safety data. Westlake scandal leads to criminal charges. I called an all-employee meeting to address the news directly. Nearly 4,000 people attended in person or virtually, the largest gathering in company history. Today's charges reflect serious alleged misconduct by former executives, I began. While the legal process must run its course, I want to be clear. The behavior described in the indictment violates everything Westlake stands for. More importantly, it violates the trust of patients who depend on us. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some I'd known for decades, others newly hired during our transformation. But this moment isn't about them. It's about us, who we are, who we choose to be going forward. The changes we're implementing aren't just reactions to this crisis. They're commitments to a fundamentally better way of operating. For the next hour, I outlined our progress and ongoing challenges with complete transparency. Employee questions were direct and sometimes difficult, but I answered each one candidly. This wasn't a performance for external stakeholders. It was a genuine conversation with the people who would ultimately determine whether our transformation succeeded or failed. The hardest work still lies ahead, I concluded. Policies and processes are relatively easy to change. Mindsets and behaviors are much harder. That's why each of you is so important to this journey. True transformation happens day by day, decision by decision, through thousands of individual choices to prioritize integrity over expediency. The response was a standing ovation, not celebratory, but resolute, a collective commitment to the path forward. Later that evening, James Chen called to inform me that the board had voted to establish a patient advocacy council with direct reporting lines to directors. The council would include medical professionals, patient representatives, and ethics experts with the authority to review and challenge any significant business decision with potential patient impact. It was Eleanor's idea, he explained, but the entire board embraced it immediately. It's exactly the kind of structural reform your transformation plan envisioned. It's a powerful statement, I agreed. It puts patient welfare at the center of our governance, not just our marketing materials. There's something else, James continued. The early succession planning for the CEO transition. The board wants to accelerate the timeline. Your leadership through this crisis has been exceptional. We'd like to announce you as CEO-elect at the next quarterly meeting. The offer was flattering but premature. I appreciate the confidence, James, but I stand by our original agreement. Let's reevaluate in a year when we can better assess our progress and needs. The transformation matters more than any title. After we hung up, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically circumstances had changed in just a few months. From abrupt termination to CEO succession planning, a journey I couldn't have anticipated or planned. But this wasn't about personal vindication or career advancement. It was about something far more meaningful, reclaiming the purpose that had drawn me to Westlake 3 decades ago. 3 months into our transformation, we faced our first major test. A promising late-stage oncology drug, developed long before the Helios acquisition, showed unexpected liver toxicity in a small percentage of trial participants. Under the old Westlake, there might have been pressure to downplay these findings or delay their disclosure. Under our new protocols, the issue was immediately escalated to the highest levels and transparently communicated to regulators, trial participants, and investors. The stock took an immediate 8% hit as the market reacted to potential delays in what had been viewed as a blockbuster program. Financial analysts peppered us with questions about revenue projections and competitive implications. It was precisely the kind of pressure that had previously led to ethical compromises. I convened the executive leadership team to determine our approach. The financial impact is real, but secondary, I said firmly. Our first priority is patient safety. Our second is scientific integrity. If we compromise on either, all our transformation work means nothing. We decided to voluntarily pause the trial, initiate a comprehensive safety review, and develop enhanced monitoring protocols before proceeding. It would delay the program by at least 6 months and cost millions in additional research expenses. The decision was medically and ethically sound, but would further test investor patience during an already challenging period. The day after announcing our decision, I did a series of investor calls to explain our reasoning. Some were skeptical, focusing on quarterly impacts. Others, however, recognized the long-term value of our approach. You're making decisions like a company that expects to be in business for decades, not just the next earnings call, one major institutional investor commented. That's refreshing in this industry. By the following week, our stock had recovered most of its initial decline as the market digested our transparent handling of the situation. Several industry publications even ran pieces praising Westlake's new era of pharmaceutical responsibility. The transformation was beginning to yield not just internal change, but external recognition. 4 months after my return, we reached a significant milestone: completion of the independent investigation into the Helios acquisition. The final report, over 300 pages, documented in painstaking detail how the fraud had occurred, who had been involved, and which control systems had failed. Most importantly, it validated our transformation approach, concluding that the misconduct had thrived in a culture where short-term results consistently trumped long-term integrity. The board publicly released the full report, an unprecedented step in an industry accustomed to carefully sanitize statements and confidential settlements. The decision wasn't without risk. The detailed accounting of our failures provided ammunition for plaintiffs' attorneys and potential ammunition for competitors. But we had committed to transparency, even when uncomfortable. We're not publishing this report because it's strategically advantageous, I explained in the accompanying press release. We're publishing it because our employees, patients, and investors deserve to understand exactly what happened and how we're ensuring it never happens again. The market's response was initially negative, with our stock dropping 5% as traders reacted to the report's stark details. By week's end, however, the decline had reversed entirely, as longer-term investors recognized the value of our transparent approach. Several governance experts publicly praised Westlake's handling of the situation, with one prominent business ethicist calling it a new standard for corporate accountability. Within Westlake, the report served as a powerful teaching tool. We developed case studies from specific incidents detailed in the investigation, using them in training sessions across the organization. Not to assign blame, but to ensure everyone understood how small compromises could accumulate into catastrophic failures. 5 months into the transformation, I received an invitation that initially seemed routine. The CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, one of our major competitors, wanted to meet for lunch. Such industry contacts weren't unusual, though the timing struck me as potentially strategic. I accepted with cautious curiosity. Martin Roberts was approximately my age, with a reputation for shrewd but ethical leadership. After brief pleasantries, he came directly to the point. "I'll be blunt, Richard. We're impressed with what you're doing at Westlake. The transparency, the accountability, the genuine reform. It's forcing all of us to examine our own practices." That wasn't our primary motivation, I noted, but it's a welcome side effect. He nodded. The industry has developed some problematic habits over the years. Habits that seemed necessary for competitive survival, but have ultimately eroded public trust. Your response to the Helios situation is challenging those assumptions. "Change is possible," I said simply. "That's actually why I wanted to meet. Meridian's board has authorized me to explore an industry initiative, a collective commitment to new standards for clinical data transparency, compensation structures, and ethics frameworks. We'd like Westlake to be a founding partner." The invitation was unexpected, but aligned perfectly with our transformation vision. Over the next hour, we discussed the potential framework for such an initiative, not as a public relations exercise, but as a substantive commitment to raising industry standards. "This won't be easy," Martin cautioned as our lunch concluded. "There will be resistance from companies worried about competitive disadvantages or legal exposure." "The greater risk is continuing, as we have been," I replied. "This industry, literally, holds lives in its hands. We have a responsibility that transcends quarterly results." As I drove back to the office, I reflected on how our crisis response was creating ripples beyond Westlake. What had begun as a devastating professional setback, my termination after 30 years, had catalyzed not just internal transformation, but potentially industry-wide change. Sometimes being pushed off a familiar path forces you to forge a better one. The following week brought another unexpected development. A graduate business school professor contacted me requesting permission to develop a case study on Westlake's transformation for her ethics curriculum. The professor, Dr. Alicia Martinez, had specialized in corporate ethics for over 20 years. "What's happening at Westlake represents a paradigm shift in crisis response," she explained when we spoke. "Most companies in your situation would focus on damage control and minimal disclosure. You've chosen the opposite approach: maximum transparency and fundamental reform. That's worth studying." I agreed to cooperate, seeing value in documenting our journey for future business leaders. Over the next several weeks, Dr. Martinez interviewed dozens of Westlake employees at various levels, from board members to laboratory technicians. Her questions were probing but fair, focused not just on what we were changing, but why and how. "The most remarkable aspect," she told me during our final interview, "isn't the policies or structures you've implemented. It's how you've maintained. Focus on your central mission, patient welfare, throughout the crisis. Many companies lose sight of their purpose when facing financial pressure or public scrutiny." "That clarity came from the crisis itself," I acknowledged. "When we discovered the concealed safety data, it crystallized what truly mattered. Stock prices recover, reputations can be rebuilt, but patients harmed by ethical failures, that damage can be irreversible." 6 months into our transformation journey, Westlake's stock had recovered to 187, still below its pre-crisis peak, but reflecting growing market confidence in our direction. More importantly, our internal metrics showed significant positive shifts in employee engagement, ethical decision-making, and scientific rigor. The industry initiative that Martin Roberts had proposed was gaining momentum, with 5 major pharmaceutical companies now committed to the framework. Financial analysts had begun referencing a Westlake effect when discussing changing standards in the sector. On the personal level, I found myself energized rather than exhausted by the challenges. At 58, when many executives would be contemplating retirement, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Not because of position or power, but because the work mattered. In the most fundamental way, Catherine noticed the change one evening as we walked along the Charles River, a ritual we'd maintained through decades of marriage. "You seem different since all this began," she observed. "More focused, more present." I considered her observation. "I spent 30 years helping build a successful company. Now I'm helping build a significant one. The distinction matters." "Eve, and the irony doesn't escape you?" she asked with a knowing smile. "That they had to fire you before that could happen?" I laughed softly. Life rarely follows the path we expect. Sometimes what looks like an ending is just a necessary redirect. As we continued walking, I reflected on the journey of these past 6 months, from the shock of abrupt termination to the discovery of serious ethical breaches, from private documentation to public transformation, from individual crisis to industry. Catalyst. The stock had indeed plummeted when the news broke that I had discovered and was willing to expose the fraud at the heart of the Helios acquisition. But that financial tremor had created the opening for something much more valuable, a fundamental recommitment to the principles that should have guided us all along. Sometimes being discarded after 30 years of loyal service isn't a tragedy. Sometimes it's the liberation you need to see clearly what matters most, and to fight for it without institutional constraints. Sometimes losing your position is the first step to finding your purpose. The path ahead remained challenging. Cultural transformation is never complete. It requires constant vigilance and renewal. Industry reform faces entrenched interests and ingrained habits, but for the first time in years, I felt aligned with work that transcended career advancement or financial success. As the sun set over Boston, casting long shadows across the river, I felt profound gratitude for the unexpected journey of these past months. Not despite the difficulties, but because of them. They had revealed what had always mattered most, hidden beneath the comfortable routines of corporate success. Sometimes it takes losing everything you thought was important to discover what truly is. Sometimes the most valuable contribution of your career comes not when you're securely established, but when you're willing to risk it all for something that matters more than security. And sometimes being fired after 30 years is the beginning, not the end, of your most important chapter. 1 year after my unexpected dismissal and subsequent return to Westlake, I stood at the podium during our annual shareholders meeting. The auditorium was filled to capacity. Institutional investors, individual shareholders, board members, employees, and even a few patients whose lives had been touched by our medications. A far cry from the crisis atmosphere of 12 months ago. A year ago, I began, Westlake faced an existential crisis. Our stock had plummeted 36% in a single day. Our leadership was in disarray. Our reputation for scientific integrity was in question. Many predicted we wouldn't survive as an independent company. I paused, glancing around the room. Many nodded, remembering those chaotic days. Today, I'm pleased to report that Westlake isn't just surviving, it's thriving in ways that transcend traditional metrics. Our stock has recovered to 215 per share, exceeding its pre-crisis peak. More importantly, we've fundamentally transformed how we operate, how we make decisions, and how we fulfill our mission of improving human health. For the next 40 minutes, I detailed the journey of the past year, the challenges we'd overcome, the structural changes we'd implemented, and the cultural shifts we'd catalyzed, not as a victory lap, but as accountability to those who had maintained faith in our transformation. The crisis that began with the Helios acquisition could have destroyed Westlake, I concluded. Instead, it became the catalyst for creating a stronger, more ethical, more patient-centered organization. We turned a potential ending into a new beginning. The applause that followed wasn't the polite acknowledgement typical of shareholder meetings. It was genuine recognition of a corporate transformation that many had deemed impossible. As I stepped away from the podium, James Chen approached, extending his hand. "You've accomplished in 1 year what most would consider impossible in 5. He said quietly. "The board's decision stands unanimously. It's time for you to accept the CEO position." This time I didn't defer or delay. The past year had demonstrated that Westlake was genuinely committed to the transformation we'd begun. My leadership as CFO had established the foundation. Now it was time to build upon it from the CEO's office. "I accept," I said simply, "with gratitude for the trust and recognition of the responsibility." James smiled, clearly pleased. "We'll announce it at the conclusion of the meeting." As the formal business portion of the gathering proceeded, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of these past 12 months. The independent investigation had ultimately resulted in criminal convictions for both Mark Johnston and Vanessa Parker. After initially pleading not guilty, both had eventually accepted plea agreements when the evidence proved overwhelming. Johnston had received a 5-year sentence for securities fraud and conspiracy to defraud the United States. Parker, who had cooperated extensively with prosecutors, received 3 years. Their fall had sent shockwaves through corporate America, serving as a stark warning about the consequences of prioritizing short-term financial metrics over ethical obligations. Several other pharmaceutical executives at different companies had quietly resigned in the aftermath, perhaps recognizing similar vulnerabilities in their own operations. More significantly, the industry initiative that had begun with Martin Roberts's lunch invitation had evolved into a formal consortium with binding commitments. The Pharmaceutical Integrity Alliance now included 11 major companies representing over 60% of the industry's market capitalization. Each had committed to enhanced transparency standards, reformed compensation structures, and strengthened ethical oversight. Within Westlake, the transformation had progressed from crisis response to institutional culture. Our whistleblower systems had become models studied by other organizations. Our scientific review processes had been enhanced to ensure data integrity at every stage. Our compensation structures now explicitly rewarded ethical leadership and patient-centered innovation rather than purely financial metrics. Most importantly, our people had changed. The fear-based silence that had allowed the Helios fraud to proceed had been replaced by a culture where questions were welcomed and concerns were treated as valuable insights rather than threats. Junior researchers now routinely challenged senior scientists on methodological questions. Financial analysts raised flags about potentially misleading metrics without fear of career repercussions. The case study that Dr. Martinez had developed about our transformation was now being taught at 17 business schools. I had guest lectured in several of her classes, sharing the lessons learned with future business leaders. The experience had been surprisingly fulfilling, an opportunity to ensure that our crisis yielded wisdom beyond our own organization. As the shareholder meeting concluded, James Chen stood to make the anticipated announcement. The board of directors is pleased to announce that Richard Harmon has been appointed Chief Executive Officer of Westlake Pharmaceuticals, effective immediately. Richard's extraordinary leadership over the past year has demonstrated that he is uniquely qualified to guide Westlake into its next chapter. The announcement was met with another round of enthusiastic applause. As I stepped forward to make brief remarks, I caught sight of Catherine in the audience, her smile conveying both pride and a hint of amusement at the circumstances that had led to this moment. I accept this responsibility with humility and determination, I told the assembled shareholders. Humility because I recognize that Westlake's transformation has been a collective achievement, not an individual one. Determination because our journey is far from complete. Following the meeting, we held a press conference where I outlined my vision for Westlake's future. Not a return to business as usual, but a continuation of the transformation we'd begun, expanding our ethical frameworks, deepening our commitment to patient welfare, and demonstrating that pharmaceutical companies could be both financially successful and morally grounded. Later that evening, Catherine and I hosted a small gathering at our home, board members, key executives, and individuals who had been instrumental in the transformation. Eleanor Katz raised her glass in a toast to Richard, who turned the worst day of his professional life into the catalyst for the most important work of his career. The sentiment touched me deeply because it captured the paradox of this journey. Had I not been abruptly dismissed after 30 years of service, I might never have been positioned to lead the transformation Westlake so desperately needed. That painful moment had ultimately created the opening for more meaningful contribution than decades of conventional success. As our guests departed, Catherine and I found a quiet moment on our back porch, the same spot where I had sat in shock, the day after my termination, uncertain of the path forward. "Did you ever imagine that day that it would lead to this?" she asked, her hand resting lightly on mine. "Not remotely," I admitted. I was angry, hurt, confused. I couldn't see past the immediate injustice of it. And now? I considered the question carefully. Now I see it as necessary disruption. Sometimes systems or people need to be shaken out of comfortable patterns to realize their full potential. The following Monday, I moved into the CEO's office, the same space that Johnston had occupied when he fired me a year earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me, but there was no sense of triumph or vindication in the transition. This wasn't about reclaiming position or status. It was about the opportunity to lead meaningful change. My first act as CEO was to establish a new tradition, monthly ethics rounds, modeled after medical rounds in teaching hospitals. Each session would examine actual ethical decisions made throughout the organization, not to assign blame, but to continuously refine our thinking and approach to complex situations. No one, including the CEO, would be exempt from having their decisions examined and discussed. "This may feel uncomfortable initially," I explained to the executive team. "We're accustomed to defending our decisions, not analyzing them collaboratively. But this transparency is essential to maintaining the culture we've worked so hard to build." To demonstrate my commitment, the first session focused on a decision I had made as CFO, a pricing strategy for a recently approved medication that balanced access considerations with financial sustainability. The discussion was thoughtful and nuanced, identifying both strengths in the approach and opportunities for improvement. "This is how we prevent ethical drift," I explained afterward. "Not through policies alone, but through ongoing, honest dialogue about the complex trade-offs we face." As my first month as CEO unfolded, I initiated a strategic review of our entire product portfolio and research pipeline, not just for financial performance, but for alignment with our renewed mission of improving patient outcomes through ethical innovation. The review led to several significant decisions. First, we discontinued development of 2 compounds that, while financially promising, offered only marginal improvements over existing therapies. The resources were redirected to programs addressing underserved medical needs, even though the commercial potential was less certain. Second, we revised our approach to patent strategies, moving away from tactics designed to extend exclusivity through minor modifications. Instead, we committed to genuine innovation that justified extended market protection. Third, we established a differential pricing model for low-income countries, ensuring our most important medications would be accessible to patients regardless of geography or economic status. Each decision involved financial trade-offs that would have been unthinkable under the previous leadership regime. Each required explaining to investors why long-term impact sometimes outweighed short-term returns. But the market was beginning to understand and value our approach, recognizing that sustainable success in healthcare required more than quarterly profit maximization. 3 months into my CEO tenure, we faced an unexpected opportunity. Helios Biotech's former founder and chief scientist, Dr. Martin Chen, no relation to our board member James, approached Westlake with a proposal. He had been pushed out of Helios shortly before the acquisition and had subsequently established a small research laboratory focused on autoimmune disorders. "I was devastated to learn how my former company manipulated data," he explained during our meeting. "That was never the culture I tried to build. I've been following Westlake's transformation with great interest, and I believe there might be a way to redeem something valuable from that unfortunate chapter. Dr. Chen's new research showed remarkable promise, early-stage work on a novel approach to treating lupus that leveraged some of the legitimate science that had been developed at Helios before the data manipulation began. I'm not interested in selling my company, he clarified, but I am interested in a strategic partnership with an organization that has demonstrated commitment to scientific integrity, even, perhaps especially, when it's difficult. The proposal was compelling but complex. Partnering with anyone associated with Helios carried reputational risk, even though Dr. Chen had no involvement in the fraud. Moreover, the scientific approach, while promising, was early stage and financially speculative. Rather than making the decision unilaterally or limiting input to senior leadership, I established a special assessment team that included scientists, ethicists, financial analysts, and patient advocates. Their task: evaluate the opportunity from multiple perspectives and develop a recommendation. After 6 weeks of thorough review, the team presented their findings. They recommended proceeding with a carefully structured partnership that included rigorous oversight mechanisms, staged investment tied to scientific milestones, and transparent disclosure of the relationship's history and parameters. The science is legitimate and potentially transformative, their report concluded. Dr. Chen's personal integrity appears unimpeached by the Helios scandal. Most importantly, this partnership would demonstrate Westlake's commitment to separating valuable science from corrupt practices, exactly the distinction at the heart of our transformation. We announced the partnership at a scientific conference rather than through a financial press release, signaling that this was primarily a scientific collaboration rather than a business transaction. The media response was initially cautious, with several outlets noting the Helios connection. But as we transparently shared the rigorous evaluation process we'd employed, the narrative shifted to one of scientific reclamation and ethical discernment. 6 months into my CEO role, Westlake was invited to participate in a special congressional hearing on pharmaceutical industry practices. Rather than sending government affairs representatives, I testified personally alongside several other industry CEOs and patient advocacy groups. A year and a half ago, Westlake stood at the center of a crisis that exemplified the worst tendencies in our industry, I acknowledged in my opening statement. Today, we appear before you not to claim we've solved all problems, but to share what we've learned about building a pharmaceutical company that balances legitimate business interests with its fundamental healthcare mission. For the next several hours, I answered questions about our transformation, the structural changes, the cultural initiatives, the financial implications. I didn't portray Westlake as perfect or our approach as the only valid one. Instead, I emphasized the ongoing nature of ethical commitment and the constant vigilance required to prevent gradual compromise. The most dangerous failures aren't typically dramatic violations of clear rules, I explained to the committee. They're slow drifts away from core principles, small compromises that seem reasonable in isolation but accumulate into significant deviations from purpose. That's why reform can't be a one-time event. It must be continuous recommitment. The hearing received significant media coverage, with several commentators noting the contrast between my candid approach and the defensive posture adopted by some other industry representatives. More importantly, it elevated the conversation about pharmaceutical ethics beyond simplistic debates about drug pricing to more fundamental questions about purpose and responsibility. 9 months into my leadership as CEO, Westlake faced its first major acquisition opportunity since the Helios disaster. Novara Therapeutics, a mid-sized company with promising gene therapy technologies, was seeking a strategic buyer. Their science, complemented our existing research platforms, and their corporate culture appeared aligned with our reformed values. The financial case was compelling, but I was acutely aware of how the Helios acquisition had revealed fundamental flaws in our due diligence and governance processes. This opportunity would test whether our transformation had created genuinely different approaches or merely surface-level changes. I established a comprehensive acquisition protocol that went far beyond traditional financial and scientific evaluation. It included a deep-dive assessment of Novara's research practices conducted by independent scientific experts, extensive interviews with their scientists at multiple levels, not just leadership, thorough evaluation of their clinical trial designs, and data management systems, assessment of their corporate culture through confidential employee surveys, review of their historical handling of safety signals and adverse events, transparent sharing of key findings with our board, including areas of concern. The process took 3 months, longer than typical industry practice, and identified several areas requiring attention. Rather than hiding these issues or using them to negotiate a lower price, we addressed them directly with Novara's leadership as conditions for proceeding. "We're not looking for perfection," I explained to their CEO. "Every organization has areas for improvement. What we're assessing is your willingness to acknowledge issues and commitment to addressing them transparently." The approach established a foundation of mutual respect and shared values that made the subsequent integration planning more collaborative than adversarial. When we eventually announced the acquisition, both the financial markets and industry observers recognized the thoughtful, methodical approach as validation of Westlake's transformed identity. 1 year into my CEO tenure, and 2 years after my abrupt dismissal, I invited the entire executive leadership team to a special off-site retreat, not to develop strategic plans or review financial projections, but to reflect on the meaning of our transformation journey and renew our commitment to its underlying principles. We gathered at a rustic conference center in the Berkshires, deliberately removed from the corporate environment. The agenda included no PowerPoint presentations or formal reports, just structured dialogue about what we had learned and how we would sustain it. 2 years ago today, I began the session. I was called into Johnston's office and told to clean out my desk. It was the most professionally painful moment of my life. The room fell silent. Many of these executives had been present during that difficult time, though none had been directly involved in the decision. I'm sharing this not to dwell on the past, but because anniversaries provide valuable opportunities for reflection. That moment of professional crisis ultimately revealed something essential: the difference between career success and meaningful contribution. Over the next 2 days, we engaged in deep conversations about purpose, values, and leadership legacy, not as abstract concepts, but as lived realities that shaped our daily decisions. Each executive shared personal reflections on moments when they had been tested, when financial pressures, competitive dynamics, or career considerations had challenged their commitment to ethical principles. The transformation we've led at Westlake isn't just about new policies or governance structures, I explained during our final session. It's about recognizing that organizational purpose must transcend organizational success, that how we achieve results matters as much as the results themselves. As the retreat concluded, we established a new tradition, an annual recommitment day when every Westlake employee, from the CEO to entry-level researchers, would pause their regular work to reflect on our core purpose and ethical foundations, not as a ceremonial exercise, but as practical renewal of what truly mattered in our work. Returning to Boston, I found an unexpected invitation waiting. Harvard Business School wanted me to deliver their distinguished leadership lecture, focusing on our transformation experience. The request was flattering, but also represented an opportunity to share our learning with future business leaders at a formative stage of their development. 2 weeks later, I stood before an auditorium filled with MBA students, faculty, and business leaders. Rather than presenting a sanitized success story, I shared the messy, complicated reality of organizational transformation. The resistance, the setbacks, the ongoing challenges. The conventional narrative about business leadership focuses on vision, strategy, execution, I told them. Those elements matter, but equally important is the courage to recognize when an organization has drifted from its purpose and the commitment to realign it, even when painful or costly. During the Q&A session, a student asked the question I'd anticipated. Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't been fired? I smiled slightly. Every day. And the honest answer is that I might never have taken the actions that ultimately proved so necessary. Sometimes our greatest contributions come not from positions of comfort and security, but from moments of disruption and challenge. Another student followed up. But surely you could have implemented these reforms without being fired first. Perhaps, I acknowledged, but there's something clarifying about that kind of professional crisis. It strips away concerns about career advancement or organizational politics. It focuses you on essentials. When I returned to Westlake, I wasn't protecting a position or pursuing a promotion. I was fighting for principles that transcended personal career considerations. The session concluded with a standing ovation. Not for me personally, but for the idea that business leadership could and should be about more than financial metrics and career advancement. As I left the stage, a faculty member commented, "You've given these students something to aspire to beyond the typical success metrics." 18 months into my CEO role, Westlake faced a unique opportunity to put our transformed values into practice. A devastating hurricane had struck Central America, destroying critical healthcare infrastructure in several countries where our medications were essential for patients with chronic conditions. The conventional corporate response would have been a modest donation coupled with carefully crafted public relations messaging. Instead, we established an emergency response team with a direct mandate: ensure that every patient dependent on Westlake medications in the affected regions maintained uninterrupted access, regardless of cost or logistical challenges. For the next 6 weeks, we operated well outside normal business parameters. We chartered private aircraft to deliver medications when commercial routes were unavailable. We established temporary distribution centers in partnership with local healthcare providers. We suspended normal billing procedures, providing medications at no cost until local healthcare systems could be restored. The financial impact was substantial, over $30 million in extraordinary expenses and foregone revenue. When questioned by analysts about this impact during our next earnings call, I was direct. There are moments when a company must demonstrate what it truly stands for. This was such a moment for Westlake. We could have prioritized quarterly results, but that would have betrayed everything we've been building. Instead, we prioritized our fundamental purpose, ensuring patients have access to the medications they need. Remarkably, the market response was positive. Our stock price actually increased following the call, as investors recognized that our approach reflected genuine commitment to purpose rather than performative corporate social responsibility. Several major institutional investors even increased their positions, citing our response as evidence of sustainable long-term value creation. 2 years into my CEO tenure, we experienced what might have been a catastrophic setback in the old Westlake culture. A promising late-stage drug candidate, one with significant projected revenue potential, failed to meet its primary endpoint in a pivotal clinical trial. Under previous leadership, there might have been pressure to find alternative endpoints that could be positioned as successful, or to design follow-up studies that could salvage the investment. Instead, we applied our transformed approach to this difficult situation. First, we immediately disclosed the unambiguous results to regulators, investors, and the scientific community. No spin, no selective presentation of data points. Second, we conducted a thorough, transparent analysis of why our preclinical and early clinical results had not translated to the larger trial, publishing the findings in a peer-reviewed journal as a contribution to scientific understanding. Third, we rapidly redeployed the affected research teams to other promising programs, rather than pursuing marginal modifications that were unlikely to yield meaningful patient benefits. The financial markets initially responded negatively, with our stock dropping 12% on the news. But as analysts and investors observed our methodical, principled approach to the setback, confidence gradually returned. Within 3 months, our stock had recovered most of its losses, and several analysts had actually upgraded their recommendations based on the integrity of our scientific processes. Westlake has demonstrated the ultimate pharmaceutical industry. Resilience, one prominent analyst wrote. Not the ability to spin disappointing results, but the scientific rigor to learn from them and redirect resources accordingly. As I approached the 2nd anniversary of my appointment as CEO and the 3rd anniversary of my abrupt dismissal, I received an unexpected communication, a handwritten letter from Mark Johnston sent from the Federal Correctional Institution, where he was serving his sentence. "Mr. Harmon," it began, "I've had considerable time for reflection these past months. I've followed Westlake's transformation from a distance, observing how you've rebuilt what I nearly destroyed. While this may mean little coming from me, I want to acknowledge that your approach has proven far more successful than I could have imagined." The letter continued with a remarkable admission. My greatest failure wasn't the fraud itself, but the culture that made it possible, a culture that valued financial metrics above scientific integrity and human welfare. You've corrected not just my specific mistakes, but the fundamental misdirection I encouraged. I shared the letter with Catherine that evening, unsure how to respond or whether to respond at all. "You don't owe him anything," she observed, "but there might be value in acknowledging his recognition of what you've accomplished." After careful consideration, I sent a brief reply. "Thank you for your letter. The transformation at Westlake hasn't been about correcting individual mistakes, but about recommitting to fundamental purpose. I hope your own reflection leads to similar clarity about what truly matters in leadership." As the 3rd anniversary of my dismissal approached, I found myself in a reflective mood. The journey from abrupt termination to transformational leadership had been neither planned nor expected. Yet it had proven to be the most significant chapter of my professional life, not despite the initial crisis, but because of it. The company I now led bore little resemblance to the one I had served for 3 decades. Our stock had fully recovered and now traded at a premium to industry peers, reflecting market recognition of our distinctive approach. Our scientific productivity had increased markedly, with more genuinely innovative compounds advancing through our pipeline. Our reputation for integrity had been fully restored and even enhanced. But the most profound changes weren't visible in financial statements or stock charts. They lived in the thousands of daily decisions made throughout the organization. Decisions now guided by clear purpose and ethical commitment, rather than short-term financial pressure. On the morning of the anniversary itself, I took a rare personal day, driving to the coast where Catherine and I had often walked during the difficult days following my dismissal. The Atlantic stretched before me, timeless and perspective-giving. Sometimes life's most painful disruptions create openings for its most meaningful contributions. Sometimes being discarded after 30 years of service isn't an ending, but an invitation to something far more significant than conventional success. As I watched the waves break against the shore, I felt profound gratitude, not despite the crisis that had begun this journey, but because of it. That moment of professional devastation had ultimately revealed what truly mattered, not just in business, but in life. The courage to stand for principles, the resilience to transform setbacks into opportunities, and the recognition that our most important legacy isn't measured in titles or compensation, but in the lives touched and the values upheld. The stock had indeed plummeted when the news broke that I had discovered and exposed corruption at the heart of a company I'd served for 30 years. But from that painful nadir had emerged something unexpected and profound: the opportunity to demonstrate what truly constitutes success, not just for a corporation, but for the humans who lead it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.